Welcome back after lunch and excuse us for the minor mishap. As we begin the 6th academic session, I request Dr. Tanusree Paul to preside over the session as chair. Dr. Tanusree Paul is a faculty member at the Women's Studies Center, Vishwabharati University, Shantiniketan, West Bengal. A geographer by training, she has extensively worked on exploring the complex issues as to how space, place and gender co-constitute each other in a globalizing world. Besides, her research interests also span gender questions in water source management, labor market, health and media. She has also published widely on these issues in reputed journals and edited volumes. We have Srimati Sakshi Lawande, Srimati Himika Chakraborty and Srimati Nobodita Mukhopadhyay as speakers for this session. Over to you, Dr. Paul.
A very good afternoon. In the beginning, I would like to thank Center for Comparative Literature for giving me this opportunity to be present here and be a part of this very, very exciting session. I have had this opportunity to take a look at the abstracts and part of the papers as well. I know it's a very difficult session. First of all, last session that to post lunch after such a good biryani. So, but we have to. I think the papers will also do justice to, our what should I say, eagerness to listen to the speakers. So, for this session, we have Sakshi Lawande, who is going to speak on Between Cultures and Nations: Immigrants' Voices in the Select Fiction of Uma Parmeshwaran. The second speaker is Himika Chakraborty, who is going to speak on the title of her talk is We Become the Story, Indigenous Storytelling and the Short Story Form in Lee Maracle's Sojourner's Truth. And the third speaker is Nobodita Mukhopadhyay. The title of her talk is Decoding Culture and Identity as Colonial Tools, How the Writing of Indigenous Subalterns Decolonized Dominant Themes of Nationhood in the Canonical Literary Historiography. So I think we are going to give the speakers about 15 minutes each. And after, I think we listen to all of them and then we take the questions and have a comprehensive discussion in the end. Okay. So with this, I invite Sakshi Lawande to give her presentation.
Thank you, ma'am. Good day, everyone. I'm Sakshi, and I'll be presenting my paper titled Between Cultures and Nations: Immigrants' Voices in the Select Fiction of Uma Parmeshwaran. Now, over the years, a lot of Indians have moved and settled in Canada. By Indians, I mean we as Indians from the country India, because in Canada, Indians are referred to as South Asians or Indo-Canadians or East Indians, because for them, Indians is indigenous, right? So this paper looks at 5 things. Second slide, please. This paper looks at 5 things. First, it explores the inner voices of immigrants in the select fiction of Uma Parmeshwaran, an Indian-born Canadian author. Second, it looks at the dynamics of nationality and identity. What role does nationality or a nation plays as far as construction of identity is concerned? Third, it looks at identity formation. So there are various aspects of diaspora like belongingness, idea of home, adjustment issues, etc. that immigrants face and that has been captured in Uma Parmeshwaran's works. Next, it looks at identity of individuals post-migration to a land which was once colonized. And lastly, it locates the immigrants' experiences as the history of indigenous of India when moved to a new land. Uma Parmeshwaran is one of the, next slide please. A little bit about the author. Uma Parmeshwaran is one of the prominent writers of the diaspora, and she particularly focuses on the condition and experiences of the immigrants once settled to a new land. Her major works include Mangoes on the Maple Tree, Trishanku, the Forever Banyan Tree, etc. Some of the key questions she addresses in her works are: where does the immigrant belong? What factors shape their identity? What are the truths? And she brings out the contemporary realities of India. Yeah, next slide. Now, Canada is said to be a melting pot. A lot of people from different nations, different origins have settled in there. Therefore, there are multiple cultures coming together. As well, once immigrants settle in a new land, they're exposed to new culture and Western value system, and this plays a sharp role in their identity formation. So cultural and ethnic diversity is said to be a reality in Canada. So when multiple cultures come together, the process of nation building becomes difficult, and furthermore, individual identity formation is complex. So, Uma Parmeshwaran identifies 4 phases of immigrant experiences in Canada. They are, she says, first, encountering the vastness and harshness of the Canadian landscape. 2, struggle of immigrants to establish themselves. 3, experiences of second generation Canadians of South Asian origin. And the fourth is determining the idea of home. One of the central conflicts an immigrant faces is that of building an idea of home. And this is exactly what Parmeshwaran deals with. She says, I quote her, every immigrant transplants part of his native land to the new country, and the transplant may be said to have taken root once the immigrant figuratively sees his native river in the river in his adopted place. So this is probably the contrast between the river Ganges and the Red River. Red River is one of the important rivers in North America and Canada. And in one of her poems, she mentions that the speaker imagines the river Ganga in that river. Next slide. So this paper looks at Sisters at the Well, a collection of poems by Uma Parmeshwaran, in which I have analyzed a few selected poems. They are The Interview, Chorus 1, Dilip, Tara, Tara's mother-in-law, Chorus 2, Race, Epiphany at the Farewell Party. These are a few poems by her which bring out immigrant voices and experiences which are probably unheard and uncovered. So let us look at each of these poems in detail. So first we have The Interview. There are 2 possible interpretations here. One, basically the poem is about an interviewee who has gone to answer an interview but is shooed away by the interviewer. So we can possibly assume interviewee to be an immigrant and the interviewer as we can assume that interviewee is the colonized and interviewer is the colonizer. So this brings out the relationship between the two and the concept of the other. Second possible interpretation is the unfair hiring practices and treatment that is meted out to immigrants when migrated to Canada. This is relevant even today. A lot of Indians, or for that matter even South Asian immigrants, tend to face discrimination in the professional front, particularly women. Second is a sequence of poems for voices. Under this, there are many poems, and each poem has one character in it. We can assume each character to be one immigrant voice trying to bring out their issue. So the first one in this sequence is a chorus. It is titled as Chorus simply. We could say that this voice represents all those immigrants who are facing the similar issue. Now here, the speaker experiences dual emotions at the same time. One, alienation, nostalgia, lack of belonging, longing for past, etc., and at the same time, hope and positive attitude towards new beginnings. So this is something that an immigrant experiences, fluctuating emotions, positive emotions, negative emotions at the same time, and this affects the process of identity building. Next poem is Dilip. This poem has a very strong character whose name is Dilip. He asks his mother a simple question: could you change my name to Jim or David or something? He is a second generation immigrant, and he asks his mother whether she could change his name to a Canadian name or an American name like David or Jim or something. Another question he asks is, when winter comes, I'll turn less brown, won't I, Ma? Another line he puts forth is, it would be nice to be like everyone else. These lines by the speaker Dilip talk about what a second generation immigrant feels and experiences. This also brings out the intergenerational conflict that immigrants face. See, the idea of home is different for a first generation immigrant and for a second generation immigrant. Being in a foreign land, they tend to associate more with the foreign land, and that becomes their home. Dilip strongly wants to be identified as a Canadian. He doesn't want to be identified as Indian, which is not the case for his mother. So, through this, we see how children of immigrant parents tend to grow between two cultures and therefore suffer identity crisis right from an early age. They also feel dissatisfied when the whites do not accept them and treat them as equal. They are less tolerant with the discriminatory behavior because they consider themselves to be Canadian and Canada as their home. Next slide, please. Next is Tara's mother-in-law. This is a simple poem in which a mother asks her son to take her back to India. This poem brings out the choice that an immigrant needs to make between the two. That is, adapting to a new culture or going back to your homeland. So this poem brings out the adjustment issues, lack of belonging, unable to adapt to a new land. I'd like to say a few lines from the poem. Open the window, sun, and let me go back to sun and air. Even sweat and flies and all, but not this, not this. This talks about the adjustment issues and difficulty to adapt to a new place. Next slide, please. Yeah. The next poem up in line is Chorus 2, which is titled as We Are New Canadians. Here, three possible interpretations are there. First, it could mean the formation of new culture, which is often a result of multiple cultures coming together. Finally, the immigrants have adopted to a new land and they identify themselves as Canadians. Second, it could refer to the arrival of immigrants or simply new settlers in Canada and are yet to adapt. And the third, it could hint at the similar plight of immigrants as the indigenous of Canada. This poem brings out immigrants' reality in terms of how they are perceived and how they are treated. Now, according to an ethnic diversity survey which was conducted in 2002, 49% of Canadians of East Indian origin reported experiencing some form of discrimination or unfair treatment based on their race or accent. This poem also deals with immigrants' children's experiences. The fact that they become victims of exploitation, racism, harassment, etc., and parents' concern towards the safety of their children. Immigrants in Canada still continue to face discrimination in their workspaces, especially during the recruitment process. The moment they reveal their name or the nation from where they come, there is discrimination or some sort of different sort of perception that the members of the dominant group tend to have towards the immigrants. One more concern is parents' concern towards their children. They say, will doors shut on them as on us? Will our children experience the same as we did? Again, the intergenerational conflict between the two. So through these pieces of work, the concept of other or from a different nation continues to pose a challenge to immigrants in terms of their treatment and perception. The second poem under this, the first poem under this is Race. Race and Epiphany at the Farewell Party both talk about racism, discrimination, exploitation that immigrants face. In the poem Race, Parmeshwaran deals with a mother's concern toward her child. All she wants is that her child returns safe from school, because there are episodes of harassment, bullying, attacks, naming, etc. All these things are happening to her child, so she wants her child to come back. Race becomes an issue of conflict and concern when one crosses the border, that is, the nation. She also compares childhood of two different generations. The parent had spent her childhood in India, whereas the child is spending his childhood in a foreign land. Therefore, again, the difference between the two generations. This brings out the point that a child becomes a victim of discrimination and domination when one crosses the border. So the idea of border and nation becomes crucial here. Then Epiphany at the Farewell Party is again a mother's concern toward a child who is into drugs, alcohol, prostitution, and other crimes. So one of the reports in 2021 said that a lot of South Asian women were victims of this. They were falling into trap of crimes, drugs, alcohol, because they were seen as sources of easy money making. So here, the voice in the poem is that of an immigrant's mother who strongly feels that India is her daughter's home and not Canada. So she questions the safety of her child in new land. If at all she was in India, it would have been much safer. She brings out that comparison. Immigrants form strong ideas of home, and torn between two cultures and nations, home too breaks into two pieces. One more reality that Parmeshwaran brings out here is that families or parents tend to remain unaware of what is happening to their children. As she puts it, I quote her, 2 years on the streets and the family never knew where she was. That's the way it always is, and then the phone call from the police, unquote. Parmeshwaran points out how the divide or the other, quote unquote other, shall always exist in one way or the other. And in her novel, Mangoes and the Maple Tree, she mentions, they, white Canadians, don't want us to assimilate. They want us out. They've never wanted us, and now we have become a real threat. So, next slide, please. Yes. So, we know that over the years, Canada is said to be one of the preferred destinations for higher education as well as job opportunities. And of course, a lot of Indians tend to be well settled there, and they do have positive experiences. But at the same time, there is other side to it. And Parmeshwaran brings out those immigrants' experiences and voices which are unheard or uncovered. She carves the inner experiences of the immigrants who are in quest of identity, and in the process find them in a world not less than colonized. So to talk about research conclusion, there are 2 points that I have come to. One is identity formation, and second is how Parmeshwaran has brought contemporary realities of Canada to the fore. So identity formation of immigrants is along these 3 things. One is nationality. The moment they cross the border, the nation, a lot happens to their identity. They belong, they are neither here nor there, where they are. Are they dangling between the two nations is the question that we need to ask. Space, culture becomes important. And thirdly, the psychological state of the immigrants, or the fluctuating emotions that they experience. All these three things alter their identity. Second, contemporary realities of India. We saw how there are unfair treatment, unfair hiring practices, and unjust treatment in the professional front. The concept of the other is still there, and there is victimization, that is in terms of racism, discrimination, exploitation in personal as well as professional spaces. So the analysis of Parmeshwaran's character suggests the other side of the story, or simply the truths of Indian immigrants in Canada. I believe that even a single individual's experience becomes experience and is counted as the history. Therefore, these inner voices of immigrants that are captured by Uma Parmeshwaran tend to become the history of the indigenous of people of India who have moved to a new land which was once colonized. Lastly, I'd like to end with the statement, next slide. The only identity they seem to adopt is that of between cultures and between nations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sakshi. I'll now request Himika to begin your presentation, and you will get 15 minutes.
All right, can I have my presentation, please? All right. Okay. Is everything set up? Should I start? Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, so my presentation is on the short story form and Lee Maracle's use of indigenous storytelling in her collection of short stories called Sojourner's Truth and Other Stories. So the short story as a literary form has been traditionally defined according to the precepts set down by its European and American pioneers like Edgar Allan Poe and Anton Chekhov as having a unity of effect without overt didacticism or representing a slice of life. Critiquing the hold of this primarily white Western definition of the short story in both the literary imagination and the publishing industry, the Canadian solo author Lee Maracle writes, next slide please. The structure of the Aristotelian story reproduces the structure of Aristotle's society, hierarchical, patriarchal, and racist. As Europe set about to establish colonial preponderance over the entire globe, it erected structures globally to exclude and limit other types of participation. Therefore, reimagining the short story form to accommodate First Nations experience and narrative practices would require a peeling back of the assumptions, metaphors, and motives that inform the Euro-American short story. This paper takes up Maracle's collection of short stories called Sojourner's Truth and Other Stories, published in 1990, to examine the contradictions present in the First Nations short story and how her use of the form navigates between orality and writing, didacticism and dilemma, Salish and English, and ambiguity and explanation. I argue that Maracle's attempt at storing up indigenous experience and memory in the colonizer's language reflects the struggle between the ambiguities of retold oral performance and the formal demands of the European short story. story form and deliberately thwarts attempts to map the narrative onto colonial cultural metaphors or ways of reading. Drawing from Maracle's theorization of Salish oratory in her essays and the German philosopher Walter Benjamin's essay, The Storyteller, I also hope to show how her use of the art of storytelling can be read as a political tool to preserve indigenous memory and experience against the informative modes of writing that Benjamin identifies with capitalism, alienation, and colonial modernity. In her preface to Sojourner's Truth, next slide please, called You Become the Trickster, Maracle offers a rough distinction between the European style of short story writing and her own craft, which is drawn from solo storytelling. She writes that short story in the European form has a beginning, middle, and an end, a plot line, a climax, and a conclusion, all of which are held together by a single metaphor. But most of our stories, that is Salish stories, don't have orthodox conclusions. That is left to the listener, who we will trust will draw useful lessons from the story. Not necessarily the lessons we wish them to draw, but all conclusions are considered valid. The listeners are drawn to the dilemma and are expected at some point in their lives to actively work themselves out of it. As the above excerpt makes clear, Maracle sees practical utility as a guiding feature of the story, even if the utility is left open-ended for each reader or listener. However, she sets this utility apart from the moral stories of the European tradition, which she finds guilty of unimaginative didacticism. While her contention that the European style of storytelling is fundamentally didactic and is one lacking in dilemma can certainly be questioned, it's her focus on utilitarian oral storytelling derived from experience that interests me in this paper. This focus on indigenous experience and its resilience against colonial repression can be seen most clearly in the story that I intend to take up. That's the first story of a collection called Bertha. But before starting with the discussion of the stories in question, I'd like to refer to Walter Benjamin's essay on how storytelling as a mode is different from novelistic or informative modes of writing. Benjamin identifies an industrialized capitalist society as the main reason as to why the art of storytelling has fallen out of use. Next slide, please. So he writes that one reason for this phenomenon is obvious. Experience has fallen in value, and it looks like it's continuing to fall into bottomlessness. Every glance at a newspaper demonstrates that it has reached a new low, that our picture, not only of the external but of the moral world as well, has overnight undergone changes which were never thought possible. The storyteller, in Benjamin's opinion, is someone born out of his interactions with the practical contexts of people's lives, and thus the tiller of the soil and the wayfaring seaman are the two representative kinds of storytellers. Since the storyteller is grounded in the experience of his life and others' lives, every story he tells contains openly or covertly something useful, or as he writes, counsel woven into the fabric of everyday life. Although this sounds like the kind of didacticism that modernist novel writers of his day would decry, Benjamin is quick to point out that wisdom or counsel is not necessarily preachy. In fact, it simply means that communicable experience that one can learn from and the continuation of the storyteller's story through his listeners. He writes, counsel is less an answer to a question than a proposal concerning the continuation of a story which is just unfolding. As an example, Benjamin he cites a story by Herodotus. He writes that Herodotus has a story about the king Samanitus of Egypt, who is defeated in battle and enslaved. So the king sees his son pass by as a slave to be executed. Then he sees his daughter pass by as a maid, but he remains stoic, he doesn't cry. But finally, when he sees one of his old servants go by as a prisoner, he starts crying and falls into the deepest mourning. Now, the storyteller, Herodotus, he does not tell us why. Why does the king burst into emotion on seeing this old servant, but not on seeing his son and daughter? So the king might have been crying because he suddenly realized that all previous social ranks has been abolished, and he is no different to one of his servants. Yet another equally valid suggestion is that the king was restraining his grief, and seeing the old servant struggle is the feather that finally makes the metaphorical dam burst. We have no way of knowing which takeaway from the story is right, or whether the explanation is yet another one. So because the story does not go into psychological detail and yet contains a kernel of truth, Benjamin argues that its value is preserved for repeated retellings, unlike a novel whose meaning gets expended once it ends. The novel and the newspaper, he says, are the product of an age of information and isolation and industrialization without the mediating influence of the storyteller, who makes it a community good. Benjamin's article in many ways anticipates Maracle's championing of the storytelling tradition of indigenous orators and community healers. In her article, Oratory on Oratory, Maracle makes very similar points about the Stolo methodology of studying through stories, although her focus lies more on how such methodology counters the narrow gaze of colonialism. Next slide, please. Salish study, she writes, looks for obstacles to growth and transformation both in the external and the internal walls. Once an understanding is achieved, the myth makers story it up in a way that they hope leads humans towards social maturity and growth. For First Nations people, study is directed at that which is not seen, not known, at what is cherished and hidden. In the discovery of the unknown lies growth. At the bare minimum, the consciousness of who we are ought to occur. Study, then, is a collective in the sense that many may participate, and collaborative in that we all wish to come to a good mind about what is cherished and hidden. The first story that I want to take up here, Bertha, I'll take up only one story because of the lack of time. It shows the struggle for survival of such storytelling practice, such Salish oratory, against the stifling narrative of capitalism and colonialism. Like many of our fellow First Nations people, Bertha, who is an elderly woman, she lives in a cramped, almost uninhabitable condition in a fish cannery colony in the town to earn a livelihood. So as you saw in the second slide, Stolo people have traditionally relied on salmon fishing as a way of livelihood, as a way of eating. So salmon is one of their main dishes. But when Bertha is transported from her native inhabitation to this cannery road, this canning of fish, this selling of fish becomes labor that is divorced from the older cultural forms that she was used to. The expository style of writing in the first half of the story, it describes the living conditions of the indigenous workers, but they are deliberately written as if to mirror the white employer, creating a narrative of white generosity despite native people's inborn laziness and ungratefulness as they see it. In the style of a company presentation or a municipal report, the third-person narrator lists the amenities and employment provided to the native workers in the cannery rows, and lists the trifling inconveniences of high tides, flooding, disease, and cheap food that are simply a part of working conditions for such unskilled labor. Almost half of the story, before it shifts into Bertha's memory, is written in this sarcastic, informative style, mirroring the colonial epistemological practices about the lives of First Nations people, characterized by its lack of effort to learn about their experiences and their stories, and its insistence on imposing a grand narrative of progress and civilization of European settler colonialism. Maracle describes this European epistemology as the right to claim discovery and then proceeding to define, delineate, and demarcate the cultural, intellectual, economic, spiritual, and physical being for the entire world. The right to speculate on what is in the mind, body, heart, and spirit of others in unquestioned agreement. as the description of the settlement and the working conditions goes on parallelly with Bertha's miserable walk back home, it becomes clear that this narrative, this epistemology, is as terribly insufficient for Bertha's experience and memories as the dwelling is for her material existence. As Bertha stumbles on the sidewalk and hears the giggle of an unnamed fellow worker girl, the narrative dramatically shifts into the changed locale of Bertha's youth, far away from the dingy cannery colony. The giggling girl's age and her drunken voice reminds Bertha of the fragments of her childhood where she had the freedom to listen to and tell stories that were not about illness, drunkenness, decay, and slow deaths. So here Miracle gestures to the fact that indigenous people, First Nations people in these horrible working conditions often take recourse to drugs and alcohol, and the young women are forced into prostitution and sexual harassment by the white employers. These memories, Bertha's memories, however, don't translate into Bertha's broken English, and it comes out as incomprehensible fragments of Salish English mixed languages. I can't pronounce it because I don't know the language, but it comes out as something like K, SR, something, but she can't speak it out loud because she's drunk and she's tired as well. But the desire to pass on these memories in the way that the grandmothers of her community had passed them on to her remains, even though she cannot find a mutually intelligible language of communication between herself and the young girl who knows no life outside the cannery row. So even as they share a drink and tears, Bertha realizes that she, once destined to have been this young girl's teacher, had nothing to give but stories, dim, only half remembered and barely understood. Because she can't communicate the stories, Bertha simply touches the girl on the cheek and whispers some words in the gentle words of her ancestors before leaving. But this fragmented, half-understood storytelling also approximates the effect that Miracle writes off in her prefatory essay. She had written that the silent language of physical metaphor is a story in itself. So although the girl is afraid of Bertha's touch and bursts into sobs, we see the transformation the next day. So when Bertha's nephew comes to the factory the next day and says that she's dead, all we get to know is that the girl, for the first time, lets out an agonized scream that she has been drowning in alcohol so far. Miracle's story does not tell us in clear-cut terms how the transformation comes about or how the dilemma is resolved, but she gives us this extralinguistic expression of agony at the loss of the community maternal figure. And Miracle almost comes close to the twist ending of the English short story tradition, where the hitherto callous girl recognizes the loss of Bertha's death, but in refusing to express this loss through linguistic expression, she also points to the insufficiency of the written story to capture the primal agony of a community whose ways of expression have been snatched away from them. The girl's scream and her physical action of letting the knife slip across her left thumb and in cutting the left thumb are therefore prelingual, extralingual expressions of grief for a mother that approximate Julia Kristofer's theorization of the semiotic maternal cora that lies outside the symbolic sphere of language. So the limited scope of this paper won't allow me to discuss the other stories in the collection, which also interrogate the form and language of the Anglo-American short story, like World War I, which destabilizes the standard European metaphors of the animal fable and the moral fable. But that is a discussion for another day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Himika. I now invite the third speaker, Nobodita Mukhopadhyay, to present your talk. And again, 15 minutes. Please keep to that.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nobodita Mukhopadhyay, and I'll be presenting a paper on titled Decoding Culture and Identity as Colonial Tools, How the Writing of Indigenous Subaltern Decolonized Dominant Themes of Nationhood in the Canonical Literary Historiography. So before I start, I would just like to narrate one small story. So back when I was in high school, every day at 11 a.m. sharp, we would say a pledge, everyone in the class, and it goes, India is my country, all Indians are my brothers and sisters. I hope most of us will remember that pledge. Now, I would want you all to focus on the word all Indians. Now, if from this place, like in 2024, if we travel back to India in 1958, the central government issued kind of an order, we could say, to the state government of West Bengal to stop its rehabilitation ministry, because it felt that the immigrants who are coming from East Bengal are becoming an economic burden. Even a few years ago, those same immigrants were a part of our nation. They were a part of this Indianness. So what is happening here, we can see that because of a political shift, suddenly a nation is divided. We are drawing a border over a geographical landmass. We are telling that these people don't belong to us anymore. We are separate, they are separate. You know, the fact that they are coming to our place is just a burden on us. We need to stop this. Now, when the central government issued this, they said that the immigrant problem is becoming untackleable. So my question is that, who is an immigrant? And at the same time, I want to ask, who is an Indian? Do all of us sitting over here consider ourselves to be Indian? In the previous sessions, Anita ma'am has said that when a state is being formed, one thing that it needs is a language and a vast literature of that particular language. Now, if we look into this, can we please move to slide number 4? Yeah, sure. Okay, so since we are figuring it out, okay. So I would like to talk about this literature. So when a nation is building, of course, like writers are writing about their struggles, you know, struggle from their common enemy, which is the Britishers. Again, my question is the enemy, the only enemy, is the British, is the westernizers, the colonizers? Are we not somewhere the enemies of our own countrymen? Are we not separating them just because suddenly we have decided that according to a political agenda, we fit into this political agenda and they do not? So therefore this culture, the literature that we are talking about, is not totally of ours. Okay, so, and here I would like to talk about one line from an essay. The essay name is Small Differences, Large Issues, the Making and Remaking of a National Border. So the essay says, if a nation is to be recognized as such among all others, it has to make itself visible as other to all the other. It basically means that if I'm building a nation, if I am in the political power, I need to make myself visible. And to make myself visible, I need a culture. I need to tell to the other people of the world, okay, so this is what my culture is, and this is how it separates you. And this is how me from you, and this is how it separates me from any one of us. Now, my question is, how do we define this culture? Who are the people who falls into this culture? Do I fall into this culture? Does someone who is right now residing in the slums of Tangra colony does that person also belong to this culture? Do we really think that? Because if we look into literature now, coming to the main point of my research, which is if we come back to literature, especially of a Bengali writer, Odhir Bishash, in his book Allar Jomite Pa, it's basically a memoir. He is an immigrant, a Dalit immigrant from East Bengal, so now Bangladesh. So when he is coming back, when he's immigrating to Calcutta, and he's writing about his experiences, we see how his writing is very different from how the Bengali Bhadralok, we are writing about the Desh Bhag, the partition and everything. To a upper class, high caste person, if he's writing about his immigrant story, the main ingredient is nostalgia. He's feeling bad because he has to left his motherland. But to someone like Odhir Bishash, it's not just nostalgia, it's a pain for struggle. He had to struggle back there, as well as when he came back, he had to struggle here twice. Not only here, he has to struggle for survival, he has to also struggle for recognition. He has to struggle for recognition to become known as a part of this country where he knows nothing, where he knows no one, and even the government which promises that yes, we will provide you support, says that, no, I can't provide you a support, you are an economical burden right now. So Now, if this is the scenario of the Bengal partition, what was happening, this alienation. Now, if we move to Canada, at the same time, the Indian Act was passed, right? Where it was said that the indigenous people, so after the war of 1812, the colonizers realized that we don't need any more people in our military right now. We have lots of people in our military. We don't need the indigenous people anymore. So what can we do with them? This is the first question. What can we do with them? So they decided, okay, let's open up some schools. And in those schools, we will train them to quote unquote forget themselves. We will train them to quote unquote forget their history and their culture. So these schools, as we all know, are known as residential schools. And Thompson Highway, in his play The Seven Sisters, writes about seven different sisters who belong to a family, and how they had each very distinct experiences of surviving the residential schools. Now, here one common point, if we see that between the writings of Adhir বিশ্বাস and Thompson Highway, is that none of their writing follows all the traditional trends or the rules or whatever we call of the literary canon. You know, when we think of Adhir বিশ্বাস writing, it's a memoir, right? Allar Jomite Pa is a memoir. A memoir is supposed to have a flow, it's supposed to narrate stories chronologically, but Adhir বিশ্বাস doesn't do that. He's just telling stories as if I'm sitting in front of him and he's just narrating me stories one by one. And his stories are not just about what happened. His stories is about what he felt. How bad he felt to come to a place which promised that, yes, we will make you a part of ourselves, and then said that, no, we don't want you anymore. We are done. It's okay. Now, this is what even Shukumar now, we can say that, you know, there can be multiple interpretation, that political interpretation, that they came later, they were part of this, that, but ultimately, if we look chronologically into the matter, we would see that this alienation was strongly because of the fact that they belonged to a lower strata of the society, or the so-called others of the society, both in the Canadian experience and in the Indian experience. Can we move to slide 10? Yeah. Yeah. So my point here is that, as the slide says, that culture is not a socio-historical phenomena. It's rather a politically driven course of action. What we think today is our culture is not really our culture in all its extents. Somewhere down the line, some political party, especially in the case of nation building, decided that this cultural aspect does not fit into our political agenda, which I'm not stressing on the fact, we can see it in our modern day also, that they decided that this particular group, this particular idea, this particular story does not fit into our narrative anymore. And if we want to propagate our narrative forward, we have to get rid of it. And the easiest way of getting rid of it is by terming them as others, terming them as someone who does not belong to the mainstream. Here, because we are running short of time, I would like to quote something, is that when it comes to nation building, whether it be it in the during the Bengal partition or during Canada, we need to remember always that nation is not just a political landmass or a geographical entity. Nation is an everyday experience. Being a part of a nation means you are experiencing this nationhood every day. Every day when I travel from my home to my maternal uncle's house, which is 20 minutes from Bangladesh border, I see people calling those who have immigrated, ওরা এখানে কি করছে, ওরা এসেছে বলে আমাদের জমিতে আজকে এত টান, ওরা আজকে এখানে আছে বলে আমাদের ভোটের এত অসুবিধা হচ্ছে, this othering is present in every part of our nation, and not just our nation, it is present in every other part of the world. So my request to you all would be to always look at history in two ways. The first is, of course, what we read in our textbook, the chronological way. For example, what happened in the 1900s, then what happened in the 2000s. And the other would be looking through the way of the narrative. Because when you look at the narrative, we just don't look at what happened. We also look at what could have happened and what did happen but we never knew about. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation by saying that if you want to believe, ask yourself, what we should believe, where we should not. Thank you.
Um, Thank you very much to all the three speakers for such brilliant presentations and also precise, and all of you have finished within the stipulated time. I think all these talks have very nicely brought out how literature can and it does act as a lens to sort of interrogate space, culture, and identity formation, and also how we can understand the lived realities associated with intersectional identity positions. I think that was a very interesting perspective. And from the third speaker, I think I would take home two very significant remarks that she made. One is culture is a politically driven action, and also nation is something that we experience every day. So I think these are very, very powerful statements that she has made, and if we had more time, we would, and I think we will be able to discuss this now. With this, I would open the floor for discussion. If you have any questions, I think the speakers will be happy to answer.
I don't have any questions.
Thank you so much for those presentations. It's the sixth and almost the last session post-lunch, but I would say that these papers really require attention, because you have raised very important points vis-a-vis our location from where we are doing literatures of Canada, literatures and cultures of Canada. Very interestingly, I would start with you, because often we have felt that are we doing Canadian literature, or should we call it literatures and cultures of Canada, because that is also a kind of monolith which is plaguing us for quite some time. To respond to your paper, I would say that when Canadian Studies was introduced as an area studies program at Jadavpur University, people debated. People felt that why, as comparative literature department, we would need to identify separate areas where we would focus. So it was also, the North American academia who were continuously thinking about area studies, and how as students of comparative literature we engaged with area studies was one thing that we always had in mind. And probably when you talk about culture as a socio-historical, is not a socio-historical phenomena, but rather a politically driven course of social events, that is probably what multiculturalism is all about. Like how, like it's an ostrich-like effort to address the complex existence of people in that geopolitical space called Canada. And I believe that that is also associated with Uma Parameshwaran. So from you, I actually had a question for you, that how would you situate the idea of Trishanku in Parameshwaran? Because you have talked about the shorts, you have talked about the poems of Uma Parameshwaran, you have also referred to the stories, the prose narratives. But there is a central ideology of Trishanku in Uma Parameshwaran, neither there, neither here. But of course, the mythical reference, to Trishanku. And then, of course, when we are continuously talking about Lee Miracles and we are talking about Sojourner's Truth, that is my suggestion that if you look at First Wives Club, the short story collection, and it opens with this story of what is society for Native women and the history of the Longhouse, because as Kolumpa Bob in her address last night say that my mom used to laugh, sing and dance in the Longhouse. So the idea of the Longhouse is definitely destabilize ideas of nation, which Tanusree has likely pointed out, that what is the idea of nation as we understand and what the first peoples in Canada understood. Those are very complex narratives which you have tried to interweave through your understanding, or I would say reading of literatures. So that's only one question that I had for you is how do you situate Trishanku? And I think sir is
I'll add to that. Um, Trishanku essentially is a myth, is a story that we have where you say that you have this king who is neither here nor there. So the question is, what is here and what is there? What is it that we understand by here and what is this that is there? Are there 2 points? The story would want you to believe that there are 2 identifiable points. But how can we, the problem is this, how can you identify one point? Right? You can talk about only a point of origin, right? And what would that point of origin be? Right, so you travel from, let's say, India, from Kolkata airport, and then you land in Toronto. So neither here nor there. Now, where are you in between in the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean? If you are going to geographically talk about it, or so what I'm trying to say is that even the Trishanku metaphor is quite problematic. I would say that it is very, very inadequate. Right? So it all depends on what you are going to conjure. You are here, you conjure a life for yourself, and you realize that this conjuring is perhaps inadequate, and you feel that if you go elsewhere, you might be able to conjure better. And then what you do is you conjure mangoes in Maple Garden. Right? Which means you are constantly struggling, working with metaphors, and you realize that metaphors are inadequate. So the problem I largely have with the idea of diaspora is that it is not sufficiently metonymic. Right? Now I'll link it up to the others also, which I would say I feel is probably the issue with the way in which we have always got stuck with the idea of the nation. Because what kind of an entity would it be? Is it an entity at all? Right? Because we look for something that is absolute, that is there for us to hold. Right? So a home is elusive, a boundary is elusive. The idea of the nation itself is very, very elusive. Because the moment you try to grasp it, it's like the eel. It's very, very slippery. But I think what we are going through today is this idea of an absolute nationalism. Right? It's absolute. It is there for everyone. India is my country, all Indians are my brothers and sisters. We used to do this in the morning at 9 o'clock. So you were doing it 11 o'clock. See, the idea of the nation has shifted from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Right? Huh? The time has changed. I don't know if we, January 30th, 10 a.m. or 11 a.m., I don't know if we do that stand-up for 1 minute. Earlier it used to be called, what was it called? October 2nd, not January 30th, what was it called? Today it's called Martyrs' Day or something. Earlier it was not called Martyrs' Day. The idea of Gandhi himself has changed. Gandhi is now floated and kept in your pocket.
Yes, sure. Thanks for the question and the observation as well. So basically in Trishanku, Parmeshwaran says that immigrants in Canada see Canada as a heaven or place where they want to be, where they want to fit in, and they're constantly trying to fit in, okay? There are struggles and challenges, of course. But when this is happening, there is a land they know they can go back to, but they cannot, or maybe they don't want to. And that is what happens, here or there. Now again, the concept of nation becomes evident when one crosses the border. When we are in India already, when we cross the border, we get to know that that is our nation, that is our nationality, and it it haunts us even more than when we are in our own land. When we go to a new land, that nationality, that longing for home, idea of belonging, idea of home becomes very important. While in your own country, you're not really thinking of home. What is home? What is belonging? No, but when you shift, when you cross those borders, those concepts become very something that comes to your mind and you tend to ponder upon it. Maybe. That is here and there. So, Parmeshwaran in one of her essays mentions that it's not about name, it lies in the spirit of that person. And that is how you identify yourself. But what happens when we tend to interact with, of course, we cannot live isolated lives. We tend to interact with institutions of whatever, of culture, of school, anything. There, that identity becomes a problem. Yeah.
Nobody is going to ask any question from the audience. I'll just have one quick question. As you know, in my introduction, it was told that I'm a geographer, and from a social science perspective, I'm just curious to know that you began your presentation with the comment that Canada is a melting pot, and then the narratives that you shared and your analysis basically showed that how the immigrants they felt in terms of alienation and marginalization. So I'm just curious to know, has there been any mention, or has she also written about how they positively meld into the culture, or how they are negotiating? Because from in the context of geography, there have been a number of studies on diaspora where they will go to, if they, even if they are going to some other country, they tend to recreate their neighborhood and their culture and identity, where I think I partly also agree with your thing that in India we may not be very enthusiastic about hoisting a flag on the Independence Day, but if we are in Canada or elsewhere in the world, all of us will suddenly feel very patriotic and would want to do that. I mean, when I was, this is something which I have experienced myself. Just not going out of the country, just going out of Bengal made me feel like this. So when I was in Delhi. So I just want to know, this is just one question, that did you find any positive intercepts that coming out of this text, like how do these identities eventually melt? As you said, Canada is a melting pot. And
Yes. So immigrants do experience positive, immigrants do have positive experiences as well. So in that collection, Sisters at the Well, there's a poem named Tara, titled Tara. In that, she's talking about the facilities which are available in Canada, and she compares it to India. She says that everything is available here, no? She tells her neighbor, everything is available throughout the seasons. So she thinks that life is easier here, life is better here because of whatever facilities, opportunities that are available. So I think that could be seen as a positive side of an immigrant's experience. Yeah.
There's a problem with being labeled Canada as a melting pot, because that is what Canada continuously tries to identify. US, which is a melting pot, and we are multicultural, we are mosaic. Where it's a where the identity of each and every stone is maintained. It becomes a part of a whole, but retaining its individual identity of the grain. transition mood, keeping in mind the presence of the big brother, United States of America. So
Mosaic actually needs another clarification.
there.
Can I make that?
Yes, please.
See, what is it that you have? We all are, I'm sure, familiar with the mosaic floor, which will have a lot of particles, and those would be those different communities. And you will be able to identify a particle only in relation to other particles around it, right? So you have identity, you have that diversity, you have all that. It is relational. I think that was the point that Julie was trying to make in her presentation. See, that's where it truly becomes a mosaic. Because if that doesn't happen, you will have enclaves, ghettos. So it's a very tricky, the mosaic in that sense is a very, very tricky thing. It all depends on the dynamics between, let's say, two particles, the friction that you have there, because you need to have friction. Because if you do not have friction, things will not be in place. So that friction needs to be there. It all depends on what kind of friction you're going to have, and what kind of friction is sustainable. That is what will define a mosaic. But very often what will happen is we would generally talk about mosaic and we say coexistence, blah, 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 everything is there. So it is a diversity. India is not a mosaic. India is not multicultural. But we generally say that India is multicultural, Canada is multicultural. We have different cultures, but I don't think we can use that term multicultural like the way in which we use it in Canada. That's what I personally believe. Maybe it's a polemical thing to say, I don't know. But
All right, just one last time I'm asking. I think there's no question, so I think we can close this session. Thank you to all the speakers for their wonderful presentations, and thank you to the audience for your patient hearing. And thank you, CCL, for inviting me. Thank you.